Welcome to the Gestalt IT Rundown, where each time we meet, we run down the IT news of the week with a variable degree of snarkiness. I'm your host, Stephen Foskett, and joining me this week, since Tom is out at Networking Field Day, is my good friend and co-host, Mr. Max Mortellaro. Welcome to the show, Max.
Hello.
It's good to have you here. Max, are you a fan of grilled cheese? Because today is National Grilled Cheese Day.
I'm a fan of all the cheese.
All the cheeses. How about licorice? Do you like licorice?
I don't know that, actually.
Well,
licorice. Oh, yeah. I love that as well. Absolutely. In any forms. Any form factor, even EDSFF.
Well, my favorite, I have to say, is the salted licorice from the Nordic countries. So if those of you who haven't had a chance to try salt licorice, give it a shot. You probably won't like it. Moving on, let's dive into some of the stories of the week and learn a little bit about this rundown of the news.
Yeah, so our first story today is about Cisco. The company withdrew from Russia back in 2022 and has now destroyed $23 million in spare parts stored in the country, according to the Russian news organization TASS. Was Cisco specifically worried about Russian espionage, or is something else happening here?
Yeah, this is an interesting story because, well, it's been passed from hand to hand in different languages and so on. If you go back to the original TASS release, it sounds like there's actually not much going on here. It sounds to me like Cisco had a bunch of spare parts in Russia that they would no longer be able to sell because of the embargo and sanctions against the country, and that they simply decided to destroy them, along with paying out some employee contracts and office furniture and vehicles, and basically shutting down operations in the country. But it's interesting to me because here in the West, I had seen a lot of sort of inferences about this story, everything from the fact that this was some new move by Cisco to even suggestions that it involved some kind of encryption and Russian espionage and supply chain attacks and all sorts of things. I'm really not sure what the answer is, but I think that if we use Occam's razor, sometimes the simplest explanation is the truth, and the simplest explanation is that Cisco was simply done in Russia and was closing out operations in January when they destroyed this equipment. Max, Raspberry Pi is receiving some new investment from a familiar name. Sony Semiconductor Solutions Corporation is pouring some money into everyone's favorite single-board computer in an effort to spur adoption of their Atrios platform for edge AI sensors. Is this a story about Sony, or is this about the strength of the Raspberry Pi at the edge?
Well, it's a really interesting story here. And, I do think that it is more about Raspberry in the end, because the platform is so popular and almost so universal. You can run pretty much everything there. It is compact, and I mean, it has so many advantages. I'm sure that many of us, you, I, and some of our listeners here also use and tinker with that. That it is more about, there is this ecosystem which already exists, which is very vibrant, and by pouring in the money into that ecosystem, they can very easily get to present the product. So definitely, there's the angle of them, fostering or spurring adoption, as you say, but in the end, they will not be able to do anything without the, let's say, the footprint that Raspberry has. I mean, if I look at it, almost everything and their dog and their cat is kind of running on the Raspberry these days, so I think that's kind of the bottom of the story here for me. And moving into another story, which is more on the AI side of things. Google released a paper last week showing that AI systems built on its custom TPU are greener than systems built on NVIDIA's last generation A100. So given the importance of AI these days, both to hyperscalers and to chip makers, this must have felt like a shot across the bow to NVIDIA. So is it really a surprise that a custom next generation processor is more efficient than the last generation general purpose GPU? What do you think about that, Stephen?
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all that these are the results. I think that anyone who's been following MLPerf, for example, has seen the tremendous trajectory of inferencing engines, and the fact that custom silicon would outperform general purpose GPU is not at all a surprise. I think, on the contrary, it's nice to see this validated, and also considering the incredible carbon footprint of all of this generative AI that's going on out there, it's nice to know that we are seeing real strong improvements in power efficiency of these systems being delivered by companies like Google, but also by companies like NVIDIA. Uh, basically last week as well, we saw the release of the next wave of MLPerf numbers, and it showed that, in fact, NVIDIA's Hopper architecture is about 4 times faster than the previous generation processors from the same company. So, and those are the ones that we're being compared to here. So overall, I would say that this is actually good news for everyone in the industry, from Google, of course, who developed a really nice 4th generation TPU, to NVIDIA, who are now delivering on their next generation technology, as well as anyone who's using generative AI, because frankly, we got to get these things a lot greener in order to have it make sense for the industry. So no surprises, and I'm happy to see that we keep moving in the right direction. Max, data compression pioneer Jacob Ziv passed away at the age of 91. With Abraham Lempel, he invented the Lempel-Ziv compression algorithm that paved the way for GIF, PNG, and zip files. Was Ziv and Lempel's algorithm instrumental in the technology we're using today beyond GIFs and memes?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's always kind of a saddening thing when we see those big pioneers pass away, because if you think about it, they've made such a huge contribution. We live in an age where storage is cheap, storage it's affordable. You can get it anywhere. We have fast internet connectivity. I mean, everything moves fast these days. But we have to remember that when this was invented, it was a very big deal. I mean, it is still a big deal today, to be able to compress the data and optimize the way you use space efficiently. But at the time, it was vital. If you think the transmission speeds that they have, if you think the limited storage that they have, and so on, this was a major invention at the time, having the ability to compress data. If you think about having a 40 meg drive and being able to compress your data on that, it was not, a thing for the fun at all. I even remember at the time when you were using those old command line compression application, you still have the name of the algorithm and so on. So, I mean, to me, it's definitely a great contributor to technology. Yeah, and with that, we have another very interesting story to close with today's general topics in the rundown. So, the conflict between MinIO and Weka intensified yesterday, as the object storage developer fired more accusations at the storage platform vendor, claiming that they are still not properly licensing this code. Although we can't comment on the merits of this case, it seems that the increasing use of open source software in the enterprise requires companies to be more careful about proper licensing and attribution. What do you think about that?
Yeah, as content creators, Max, you and I'm sure, have experienced the world of copyright infringement and have been frustrated and annoyed and pretty vexed by it over the years. I know I am constantly having people rip off my writing and passing it off as their own on their websites, and often it's shady people with link farms and things like that. It's not cool. And it's kind of the same thing when it comes to open source software. Essentially, if you're using open source software, then you are required to abide by the license, full stop. That means, in most cases, a pretty simple process of disclosing which projects, which open source software you're using, sharing their licenses, and of course, abiding by their requirements to contribute your code back in some cases, or just disclosure. And I would say that any company that's using open source software really needs to disclose which open source software they're doing. And there are many companies out there that are doing this extremely well. I'm using an Apple MacBook to record this, and Apple uses a lot of open source software and discloses all of that open source software. They contribute to these projects They've contributed their own software back to the world, and it really, really helps kind of bring us all forward. And that's true of all sorts of open source projects. In storage, of course, we have the incredibly important ZFS software. We've got things like Ceph, and of course, MinIO, which is by far the leading platform for object storage. It is no shock to me that a company would choose to use MinIO's software as their platform for offering S3 compatible object storage, because the product works really, really well. It's really well developed. It's frankly one of the leading S3 compatible object stores out there, and even including Amazon S3. So in that case, I actually come to question when a company comes to me and says they develop their own object store. I basically, my first question is why? Why wouldn't you just use MinIO? It seems that a lot of storage companies have that same conclusion and are using it. So again, I'm not sure what the details are here. I'm not sure what Weka is and isn't using. And frankly, I'm going to leave it to them to explain what they are and to disclose what they are and to comply with the licenses. But I will say, any other company that's using MinIO's code, why don't you go make sure you're compliant with that license? Why don't you get an open source trained lawyer to go through and make sure you're doing the right thing there? Why don't you contact MinIO, and why don't you let them know and let the world know that you're using this software? Seems to me that that's what they're asking for, is proper attribution and disclosure. And I think that's fair, considering that that's what the license says. And I will further say that it always does feel a little bit like pulling the rug out when an open source project changes licenses. That's what happened with the MinIO software. They changed from Apache to AGPL. And maybe some people didn't like that, but the bottom line is that these are still open source licenses. You're still able to use the software. Maybe some of the other requirements have changed, and maybe that's going to cause you to reevaluate your use of the product. But there again, I don't see any reason not to use the new stuff and abide by the new license, especially since if you're using something as critical as an object storage platform, you want to make sure that you're up to date with the latest bug fixes and patches and so on. So absolutely, in this situation, if I was in the case of any storage company that was using this, I would make sure that I was complying with the license and I'd use the latest stuff. And finally, one more thing, I could see that this might cause some concern for end users. I just want to reassure you that no one here is saying, and hopefully no one will say, that end users are at risk for using this software. It's great software. It works really well. Honestly, the only risk is if you're using out-of-date software that might have a security problem or something. But in no case, I can imagine, would a company basically force an end user to stop using open source software. I think that this is all about kind of the maneuverings and the market positioning and so on of companies, rather than any impact on end users using this software. So please do feel rest assured, I guess. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not giving you advice legally, but I would say that personally, I can't see a situation where you would be forced to abandon some sort of technology decision that you made based on what essentially is a licensing spat between two companies that will probably be resolved pretty quickly.
So now let's take a look at this week's main story. China is reportedly blocking multiple mergers and is now investigating Micron for an unspecified cybersecurity concern. Delays include Intel acquisition of Tower Semiconductor, Maxlinear's purchase of Silicon Motion, Broadcom's acquisition of VMware, and Microsoft bids for Activision Blizzard, as well as the long delay in Cisco's acquisition of Acacia and the called-off purchase of NXP by Qualcomm, which we reported on previously. The latest move against Micron seems designed to antagonize rather than investigate any real cybersecurity flaws at the memory provider. What's going on here?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. And, from the perspective of an American who is interested in technology, it seems to me that the United States' aggressive moves against the Chinese tech sector over the last few years are starting to have some blowback in the other direction. As you say, China has the ability to review and, in many cases, block acquisitions and mergers of companies, even companies that aren't directly, in the Chinese market. So, for example, Activision, Blizzard, and Microsoft. It seems kind of funny to think that China's Office of Competition might have a problem with that merger because there's a Chinese impact, but it's not like either of those are China companies in China. But still, they're a very powerful country. They're a very powerful review situation. They can block these things, and they can interfere with these things, and they can delay them. We've seen a lot of delays in tech acquisitions, and the supposition now is that a lot of that stuff is happening as basically retribution against the United States specifically, and the West generally, trying to block the transfer of technology into China, which we've reported about again and again and again. It's interesting that we're starting to see the ways in which China can sort of fight back. Another example this week was some rumors that China would start blocking the export of so-called rare earth metals, which are used in manufacture, especially of electric vehicle batteries and motors. There again, it's not so much an official government pronouncement as it is sort of dragging feet and delay and confusion about exports and so on. It's one of those things, I think, that's supposed to send a message without necessarily causing a major diplomatic incident. This move against Micron is very puzzling, though, because Micron, as you know, is a memory manufacturer primarily. They're one of the biggest companies in the DRAM space. And to have a very succinct announcement that the government was investigating some sort of cybersecurity related flaw in Micron's products, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me from a technical perspective. I'm not sure exactly how memory would provide a cybersecurity flaw. I'm not sure exactly what's going on here. Maybe we'll come back in 6 months and say, oh my gosh, there was a thing. But I suspect it's not. I suspect that this is just another example of foot dragging. And frankly, it reflects the global geopolitical system that we're living in today, where the West, led by the United States, is really fighting back against Chinese technical dominance and trying to get manufacturing out of China. Now, Max, it's really lucky to have you here as well, because you maybe have a different perspective as someone who is not in the United States and maybe is hearing a different angle on these stories over there in Europe.
Yeah, definitely. So this is, by the way, something which is, it is kind of exciting for me in a way, because I have a lot of interest in all geopolitical matters and the big game, the big story, what's going on in the world, the big powers, etc. So definitely my perspective is somewhat different, because whenever I'm tuning up to U.S. media, everything is about China. It started with Trump, which said China all the time. This trend has continued with the Biden administration. So we really see that it is not a matter of, and I will try not to go into the political stuff, but it is not a matter of political lines, but rather a clear competition between an existing established superpower, the United States, and an emerging superpower, China, right? So, and both countries have understood that technological dominance is absolutely essential in today's and in the future economies, and therefore everybody's trying to kind of assert their position, right? There's been so many discussions about the lack of kind of sovereign technology industry, and we're talking about processors, memory. The core stuff, everything was moved away to China because it was cheap at the time, without even thinking about the consequences of where that would lead 20, 30 years forward. So there's definitely here, all of these things are clearly answers or ways to say to the US, look, we also have ways to put pressure on you, right? So I do not see that as you say, if you look at Micron and the so-called cybersecurity incident, I don't see what could be a cybersecurity incident. What could go wrong in a flash chip, for example, right? It's not like we're talking about processors or code or things of that kind. So I mean, to sum it up for me, it is more a matter of geopolitical state of things and applying pressure where possible. By the way, you also know that the current situation around Taiwan is rather, let's say, severe. I mean, they supposedly finished their exercises, but we have so many companies producing technology which are based out of Taiwan that you have to think about what's the impact for that. And I'm dealing with some customers which are procuring infrastructure, and that is starting to become a point of discussion when we talk with vendors. I mean, where are you producing your hardware? Or do you have production lines outside of Taiwan, outside of China? Because we want to make sure that we can procure the hardware, whatever we need, without being at the mercy of some major geopolitical events.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here with the situation between the US and China, and of course, Europe, as you mentioned as well. Uh, and it's hard to say how this is all going to shake out, but I do think that China is realizing that they have power here, even if they don't control the patents and the core technology, for example, with semiconductor manufacturing. They do control the purse strings and the production, and in many cases the ability to interfere with mergers and acquisitions, and that's frankly a way that they can exert some control. And given the situation, given the conflicts here, I expect this to continue. And as I said at the top, I would expect this to continue for companies unrelated, or at least not seemingly directly related to China. So get ready. I think there's going to be more blockage, more foot dragging, and more diplomatic challenges coming from China. Before we go, let's take a look at what's going on in the weeks ahead. As I mentioned at the beginning, Tom Hollingsworth is not here with us this week because he's hosting Networking Field Day 31. Go to the Tech Field Day website or LinkedIn and watch those videos live today, Wednesday and Thursday, April 12th and 13th. Also, in a couple of weeks, we're going to be at HPE Aruba Atmosphere. We'll be hosting Networking Field Day there, so check that out as well. And finally, we will return with another Mobility Field Day event, May 17th through 19th. That's Mobility Field Day 9. All of these can be watched live at the Tech Field Day LinkedIn channel or, of course, at techfieldday.com. Thanks for watching the Gestalt IT Rundown. You can catch new episodes every Wednesday as a YouTube video at YouTube/Gestalt IT Video or in your favorite podcast application. We'll be back next Wednesday to talk about all of the IT news from the week that was. Until then, for myself, for the missing Mr. Tom Hollingsworth, we miss you. We'll see you soon. And for all of us here in the Gestalt IT family, here's wishing you and yours a great day.